where does the role of more radical activism come in? And at what point does that become quote unquote acceptable?
Well, I think it's acceptable right now. It depends who you ask. I mean, there's been a big debate going on social media in the past 2 days about what's acceptable and what's not, because there's a new paper was just introduced criticizing people who throw soup and paint and etc. on artwork, even though the type of these quote unquote radical tactics so far have basically thrown soup and paint on coverings of artwork, right? So they haven't even damaged the artwork. They've just damaged the frames, if they've damaged anything at all. So they just have to get swapped out. So, I mean, there's still a debate about what's acceptable and what's not. But I believe, as far as I'm concerned, given where we are in the climate crisis, given how much we're starting to see the effects of the climate crisis in the ways that weather patterns are changing, in temperatures right now, in sea temperatures, which are terrifying if you've looked at any of these charts, in terms of the fact that we have broken records like every month for almost a year now, and the average temperature has gone above 1.5 degrees average warming, which does not mean we have surpassed the targets from the Paris Agreement, but it means that we are on track to surpass it quite soon. All of these things show, as far as I'm concerned, we are in an all hands on deck kind of a moment where we need to push every type of collective effort we can to push for the types of social changes that are needed. And as far as I'm concerned, as somebody who studies this and studies the way that activism plays a role in democratic decision making, that means that radical tactics are needed. And when I say that right now, I mean, I think that, when we look at what we're seeing more and more activists engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, which is the kind of radical tactic that I'm talking about here. I am not talking about coups. I'm not talking about violence. I think that violence can be counterproductive. We have seen some of that in the United States coming from the right in recent years, particularly January 6th. But that is not what I'm talking about. And we have not seen any evidence that activists currently are thinking about transitioning to more violence. What they are transitioning to is this kind of radical way of engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, which is disruptive to our everyday lives, but is very peaceful and is all about drawing more attention to the climate crisis.
So whenever I see, on the news or on social media of somebody, gluing their hand to the street or throwing soup on a painting or something like that, in my mind, I'm like, that gets a headline. That gets people talking about it. Even though the actual action itself, everybody's debating in the comments on, oh, they should have done this, they shouldn't have. The fact that people are talking about it and the fact that now there's this sort of image out there of, oh, there are activists doing this. To me, that's the positive.
You just described exactly why the activists are doing this. And in the book, I call them the shockers, which are folks who are basically using these performative acts of protest that include nonviolent civil disobedience to shock the public and get attention through the media, which gets out to the general public.
Totally. No, the media loves a, to highlight something. I mean,
loves a good picture. They love a good picture with a little paint. Yep.
Totally.
A little food.
And do you in your research and your work, do you find that the positives of that, of getting the message out and getting people talking about it, outweighs people getting turned off by it, by seeing that and going, oh, these people are crazy?
Well, okay, so there are a couple different ways to think about it, right? So a lot of people ask me about whether this type of tactic is effective. And it depends on what you're measuring as effectiveness. I mean, is throwing soup on a painting going to reduce the carbon consumption of the United States of America or of, any country for that matter? No. Is it going to draw attention to the climate crisis? Absolutely. And we've seen many, many examples of that. You can just look at it in terms of the number of headlines these folks have gotten. Or there was a really great discussion about this that happened right after the soup toss that was at the Mona Lisa in France.
That's a big one.
Yeah, there was a big debate going on online. I mean, the thing is, it was a big one, but what was amazing was that Louvre, they were prepared for it, and they basically brought these black screens and put them up within 2 minutes. You couldn't see, right? You couldn't see the activists. You couldn't see the painting, I think, went down into its safe space anyway, but it blocked it out. But they got that video. But what was amazing about it is there was this whole debate going on online, and then somebody posted the front page of the Washington Post, which was a picture. It was a video of the young people throwing the soup, And then next to it, it was the organization and their demands, right next to each other, front page, Washington Post. You can't pay for that kind of advertising, right? That's why they're doing it. And folks like me get called up to talk on all of these interesting media outlets. And, it starts out with, oh, look at what they did. Can you believe it? And then after we have the conversation about why they did it, I end up saying, well, this is why these people are feeling that it's so concern worthy that they are actually taking time to get arrested and engage in this act of civil disobedience. And that is that's the whole conversation. And in a lot of cases, we've seen evidence that shows that these types of actions do not get a lot of support generally from the public, but the general public tends instead to draw attention to the issue, and it gets more attention and support from moderate factions of the movement, right? So one of the ways that I collect my data is I survey protesters. So I was at the March 10 Fossil Fuels, which happened in New York City in September before the big UN meeting happened. There were 75,000 people in the streets of New York City. So I go out with a team of researchers and we go through the crowd in teams. So we get we take random samples throughout the crowd so that we have a general sense of the opinions of the crowd, right? So we collected data at this protest, and I added to the survey that I usually ask, I added 2 questions that said, do you support organizations engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, such as, and I listed sit-ins, disruption, throwing food, etc. So I had a whole list of them, right? So it was the stuff that we've been seeing. And I actually thought what I would get from this is that I could do some analysis about who supports and who doesn't support these kinds of tactics. See if it's people who are more, have their political ideology or their age or their education or where they're from. We could do some really interesting things, but I couldn't do it. Not one person in the crowd did not support organizations doing this action. They all either supported or strongly supported. And this was people who mostly had no participation or experience in nonviolent civil disobedience. But they were still supporting the tactics because they felt like it was useful for the movement. So, the people who make these claims that it turns off activists absolutely doesn't do that. There's evidence that it draws support to more moderate factions of the movement, but we do not have evidence specifically from these direct actions yet. We need to do that research. Somebody needs to fund that research, I can tell you that. But right now, we know a lot about this from history, where there have been a lot of other examples of the radical tactics being used in the civil rights movement, in the women's movement, in women's suffrage. And so the evidence from those occurrences and those movements tells us about what we should expect. And I haven't seen anything to show that that's not the case in this movement as well.